Well, how about if we begin? I want to say a welcome on behalf of everybody at the National Catholic Reporter. We're very delighted to be here today. We're delighted with our esteemed guests as well. I'm very delighted to report to you that David Gibson of Fordham University has very graciously agreed to serve as a moderator for today. So David, with that, I'd like to turn it over to you. I will remind everybody before we begin that today's session will be recorded and you'll be receiving a link to that recording later. So just so you know that as well. And there, with all of that, David, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Lori. I appreciate it. And thank you to National Catholic Reporter for hosting an event like this, Catholics and the Election. Nothing uh, perhaps more pivotal at this moment, and an opportunity to shed more light than heat in an election and a campaign that seems characterized by heat and nothing else. So looking forward to doing this, and I appreciate the opportunity here. Let me just briefly introduce my colleagues here, three panelists, and their full bios are in the information you receive. So I'll just do a summary. Kathleen Bonnette is on staff at the Center on Faith and Justice at Georgetown University, where she also teaches theology. Um, her focus areas include moral theology, Catholic social thought, Augustinian spirituality, and ecofeminism. She's a wonderful and prolific writer in outlets such as America, the Jesuit Review, U.S. Catholic, and Millennial. We also have my friend Daniel Rober. Dan is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Catholic Studies at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. His research and publication interests include philosophical theology, the history and theology of the Second Vatican Council, Catholic higher education, secularization, and the relationship between Catholicism and politics, our topic today. And finally, Michael Sean Winters. Michael Sean has been a columnist at NCR since 2009. Probably needs no introduction to this crowd, but of course, we have to give him one. He's also a fellow at the Sacred Heart University at the Center for Catholic Studies. And previously, he was a fellow at the Greenberg Center at Trinity College, Hartford. He's written a couple of books on Catholics and politics. And so I'm happy to welcome you all here for this discussion. And again, I think if Lori didn't say, feel free, I believe, to post your questions in the chat. I think that's how we're doing it. And I will keep a tabs on them, and I will be happy to, yes, please post here. And I'll be happy to scan through them. And I'll begin by asking a few questions, but I also want to pick up some cues from you all in our online audience. So let's start out. First question, the most salient thing these days, two-parter. Should Kamala Harris have gone to the Al Smith dinner? And would you have gone to the Al Smith dinner? Michael Sean Winters.
Wrote a column beforehand saying she should not go. He would be boorish, and there would be no real way to respond to that in the moment. I think I was proven right by events. Would I have gone to, help support Catholic charities and as just as a loyal Catholic? Of course, I would also have gone had I been a nominee of either party, which is an unlikely scenario, but I would have gone, but I think also it would have been different for someone who was a Catholic to respond in real time to Trump's boorish behavior, especially one who's been a kind of sharp-edged and sharp-elbowed columnist for 15 years.
Kathleen, should she have gone? Would you have gone?
I am actually with Michael Sean on this one. I don't think I think she was wise to refrain. I am not sure what the food menu was, so I can't really comment on that. But what I will say is that generally speaking, I think bringing the two candidates together towards the end in a sort of jovial and lighthearted way is a helpful way to illustrate that we can move beyond party differences, policy differences, and still maintain a sense of community and unity in normal times. But this is not a normal time. I think we have, a candidate who is actively undermining our democracy, who is using the threat of military force against United States citizens, who is engaging in incredibly vitriolic and demeaning rhetoric and policy proposals toward the marginalized among us. And so to give a platform that seems to equivocate or seems to offer a way of putting them on, giving a sort of normalizing that behavior is really problematic. I think we're kind of in a choose your own adventure moment. And for Catholics, I think we need to really think about what kinds of messages we're sending.
Dan Rober.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to build a little bit on what my colleagues here have said, but I think when thinking about Vice President Harris's decision not to attend, I think it's useful to compare the event to something like the presidential debate, right, which is a formal venue for candidates to discuss views on the issues, right, and to engage with one another in a serious way about the distinctions between their parties, between their candidacies, between their policies. The Al Smith dinner is supposed to be a civil place for the candidates to engage with one another and to raise money for Catholic charities. But it's clear this is not the first go-round where Donald Trump has been invited. It was clear the last time around that he did not treat it that way. He treated it like another campaign stop, another rally. And in light of the way in which putting him on such a platform normalizes his campaign in terms of its rhetoric, in terms of what it's doing, I think the vice president was well justified in not going, as she would have been if Trump had not been invited too. It shouldn't be a political rally for either candidate. Myself, I think I would have been uncomfortable going for some of the reasons that Kathleen pointed out. Well, first of all, the ticket prices would be very expensive, especially then to be in an atmosphere where, in this case, you have Donald Trump telling really nasty jokes and having the Archbishop of New York up there laughing at them, right? At the kind of jokes that I wouldn't tell in front of my mother. Or wouldn't tell at all, really, and wouldn't expect somebody in a position of authority to be in the church to be laughing along with. So, long story short, I don't think the vice president or myself would be comfortable going.
Yeah, I was kind of, which suits my moderator's role here. I felt strongly both ways. At first I thought she should have gone. It was, going to hurt her as an opportunity. But I've kind of come around, I think, to you all's view. I guess the point, and also apropos of what we're talking about, is this going to hurt her? Is it going to help Donald Trump? Is it going to, can anything like this, or is this a tempest in our own Catholic teapot when it comes to the wider electorate? Michael Sean, what do you think?
It was a Midtown New York story. It lasted for about 4 hours. I don't think it hurts her at all in places she has to be worrying about being hurt. The blue collar Catholics in Scranton are going to vote for her or not vote for her based on 20 other reasons ahead of whether or not she went to the Al Smith dinner. I don't think it has any impact whatsoever.
Well, apropos of that, and I want to point to everybody, and maybe Laura, you can put the link to the NCR poll. I think a recent story on again those very voters. I think you're talking about in those swing states, Pennsylvania, some of those Midwestern states that honestly are very likely to decide this election, based on perhaps a few tens of thousands of Catholics, probably white Catholic voters. Michael Sean, how's she doing? And how is Trump doing in those key demographics in those key states?
So our poll, which had a margin of error of 2.86 plus or minus, had Trump winning the Catholic vote overall 50 to 45. That said she was doing better among Latino and Black Catholics. Trump was doing better among white Catholics. And I think what our poll showed was there were a lot of little things. One of the most interesting things were people get their political views from their parties, not from their church. I mean, that came through. One of the questions I was hoping the numbers were going to be higher was we asked, so if you're a Catholic and you have already said you support Harris, do you support her because or in spite of her position on abortion? And I was hoping the in spite of number, with at least it would be this nod to the understanding that, they disagreed with her on this as Catholics, but they were still going to vote for her. That was only like 13%. And for Trump, the question was about immigration. Did you vote for him despite his positions on immigration? And that number was 9%. And that was very disappointing. But it was also very illustrative. People get their political views from politics, not from their churches. I think 13% said that their priest's viewpoint had influenced their point of view, only 13%. For the bishops, that number was 10%. So people they get their opinions from media, from their friends, from their communities, but not from their clergy and not from the church.
And I imagine that 10% being influenced by the bishop did not break it down into whether the bishop's opinion drove them the other way, as opposed to influencing them in one direction. Kathleen, what's going on here? Why? I mean, it's interesting, these divisions, especially between white Catholics and Latino Catholics, which is a huge thing. Just they see things completely differently. What is drawing people? I guess the first question, what is drawing, especially these white Catholic voters, to someone like Donald Trump?
Yeah, I love that question. I think that is something I am really grappling with right now. I think we tend to kind of gloss over the differences, right? Like, oh, it's 50-45, but we can break it down further according to race, but, generally speaking, 50-45. But I think when we really look at the fact that, what was it, Michael Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, but 70% of Latino Catholics and 75% of Black Catholics are going for Harris. And then, what was it, 70% of white Catholics?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that is a huge difference, right? And so in our faith tradition, when we know that we are called to care for the most marginalized, right? When our faith calls us to look at policy and look at community building through the lens of those who are have been marginalized by our systems and are most likely to be exploited by those systems, I think white Catholics, myself included, really need to do some soul searching, right? If our political views are that different from our Black and Hispanic Catholic siblings, that should challenge us in some big ways, right? And I think, more broadly, the Republican Party right now is 70% white and Christian. And so when we talk about the effect that Christianity or Catholicism is having in this election, overwhelmingly, white Christians are propping up a movement that is rooted in the marginalization and demeaning of vulnerable populations. And I think as Christians, that is just really tragic.
Dan, same question to you. What's drawing people, so many Catholics, especially in these battleground areas, the key kind of white Catholic demographic, to Donald Trump, a man like Donald Trump?
I think there's a complex variety of things going on. I mean, one of the things I was going to say before with regard to the Al Smith dinner was the kind of irony of how Al Smith himself, right, was viciously attacked on the campaign trail in these kind of nativist, anti-immigrant for being, child of Irish immigrants, right, being raised in the Fulton Fish Market, as he talked about. Whereas now many Catholics, with the passage of time, right, and most of them from these kind of immigrant groups from the mid 19th to the early 20th century, have become much more willing to embrace nativist themes, especially when they fit into sort of broader narratives about what's been going on in their communities, right? Why they see problems of underemployment or different kinds of employment in their communities relative to the kind of blue collar work that used to be available, different forms of addiction in their communities, the idea that their children aren't able to get ahead of them the way they got ahead of their parents. So I think as Michael Sean has pointed out, right, there is some of that, right, of feeling like the solutions proposed by the Democrats, by the Obama administration, and by the Biden administration haven't helped them adequately. And again, especially inflation, right, has been high, right? That's a kind of basic economic fundamental that would usually favor a challenger in any election cycle. And it actually attests in some ways to how well Harris has been doing in terms of outperforming that particular point, and in fact, pulling ahead on the economy. I also think there is, right, there has been a growing affiliation of Catholics with the Republicans going back to the Nixon era, right? Going back to the Nixon administration and then to the so-called Reagan Democrats, to these blue collar Democrats, many of them in the Midwest, right? Michigan, Macomb County, Michigan was the epicenter of Reagan Democrats, just as it was the epicenter of discussion about Trump voters in 2016, right? Many of them working class Catholics who work or have worked in places like automobile factories in that area, right? Because remember, in the Detroit area, right, the city is very diffuse itself, and many of the residents do not go into the city for work, even though they live in the metro area. It's a very suburban centered area. Many of them working there. And I also think there is a sense among many Catholics that the Republican Party is the pro-life party, that this is something that Catholics were supposed to support. So, as Michael Sean was saying, it may not be the decisive thing for many of them, but it may be kind of a tiebreaker for a lot of them. Like, I don't know what I think about either of these people, but I kind of feel like as a Catholic, this is how I'm supposed to vote. So I think there is some of that going on among everything else.
Yeah, I want to get to some of those specific issues real quick. There's a question, a good question in the chat. Michael Sean, it's basically about polling, and the polling is a real challenge. How much we see these polls going all over the map and polling on different demographics, and Harris is up, Harris is down, how much should we trust or even follow these things? I mean, and just the whole science of polling. I've talked to friends of mine at various polling outfits. It's so hard to get reliable numbers. How much should we trust these? How much should we be focused on these here in these last 2 weeks?
I think as a general rule, I'm not going to die on any one number, but I do think if you see certain trends, you see those trends in different polls using different methodologies, it probably points to something that's going on with public opinion. What is shocking is, so when I worked on a presidential campaign in 2004, I think you had to make 10 phone calls to get one connection and person who was willing to answer. That number is now up to 200 to 1. So the cost of polling is exorbitant. And I would say there's a great deal of irresponsible reporting about polls, because once you get off the mainline numbers in your largest group and you get into subsets of demographics, and not just like Latinos, but Latino women or Latino young women, at that point, the margin of errors go off the charts, and you can't really rely on that again, unless you see trends, across the way. I want to jump back though to one thing just to follow up in what Kathleen and Dan said, and I think that the word that we were missing was elite, and I think we miss in American culture today the people for whom religion is a principal important part of their identity. And one of the more interesting things in our poll was 87% said their Catholic identity was really important to them, even though only a quarter said they went to mass every week. I mean, it was, that really does seem to matter to them. And insofar as the number one like cultural political divide is what they call the diploma divide between the highly educated and those who in the working class. And I think it explains a lot of this election is uh, working class people and religious people feel elites hate them, and they are now returning the favor. And they look at Trump as a champion. And so every time he's outrageous, every time he says things that we say, oh my God, they don't care because he's going after the rules that of the elites and wrote. And I think we overlook that, because we all look at us. We're all associated with a university,
Mm.
right? And so the people that we interact with don't have that resentment. One of the real, scales falling from my eyes moments this year was reading James Davison Hunter's book, and I reviewed it at NCR back in June, and he just said, for people without college degrees, especially for Democrats in the heartland, who were the backbone of the party, and the way they experienced the 2008 economic meltdown and the response by both parties to that left like a real sense of betrayal.
Mm.
And those people, they're angry. And Romney was obviously not going to be a proper vehicle for their anger against the elites. But Trump was. And
But Trump,
and he tapped into something that has deep and ugly roots going back to Pat Buchanan and George Wallace and in some sense back to Lindbergh. But he also is tapping into something that's really understandable. And in that, it's not just the economics. It is a sense that America's cultural educated elites look down on religion. You look at institutions that once I think used to span ideological concerns like the ACLU, and they become very anti-religious. And I don't think there's no other way to characterize their position. So
yeah.
I think we've got to the soul searching has to happen at a lot of different levels. And to use just one very specific example, and I hear this from my pro-life friends all the time, Democrats talk about the marginalized, and the unemployed and the undocumented, but they always forget about the unborn. And it just makes them they feel it makes the Democrats look completely without credibility.
Of course,
Can you jump in on that?
Donald Trump, yeah, please. Donald Trump is an elitist, but I think, cultural elites are it's the cult, and he talks the talk of that whole thing. Please, Kathleen, yeah.
I was just going to say, I think there, I don't want to say this. I think there's been a failure of catechesis, a failure of discipleship when we're looking at because we have so many resources in our faith tradition that could move us beyond that, right? That, if the most educated are holding a particular view and it's causing this divisiveness with other wise educated people, I think, for example, the See Judge Act method, right? Where that our faith calls us to continuously seek out other perspectives, right? And even that alone can help move beyond these kinds of silos that we build, right? But then I also would say, I think there's a way in which this election is about control, right? And I think there's, as we get more fearful, right? If we start to see like, oh, I don't know if if I'm being supported, I don't know what's going to happen to me. We try to hold on to things. We try to control it. And often that comes out in trying to control others, trying to dominate, right? Which is really problematic, especially when we're talking about a democracy. So I think there are a whole lot of resources in our church and theological insights that could be really helpful here and are not being conveyed. And also, just to touch on the abortion question too, I agree. I think Democrats could do a better job of saying, hey, we are caring about the unborn. But I think there's been a distortion and sort of I'm going to say manipulation of the way that we look at and talk about abortion in the Catholic Church, particularly when, we can't have conversations about the connection between female bodily integrity and the right to life and how they go together and the nuances there. And so when we look at democratic policies, we know that what reduces abortion, if that is our preeminent priority, what reduces abortion are the social support measures being proposed by Democrats, right? They're the maternal health care, the anti-poverty measures. So, laws prohibiting abortion actually don't work, and the abortion rates go up. So, I think that is something that most Catholics don't hear a lot, and would again help to nuance the conversation.
Can I also add a quick wrinkle, just to
Please.
Megalshawn's point? So there, the degree gap is clearly true. I think that's something in the polling that's clearly going on, right? In terms of, but one of the interesting nuances to the degree gap is there's also a degree gap in church attendance, right? So church attendance tends to be higher among those who are more educated. And church attendance also tends to be correlated with voting Republican. So in other words, among the educated who are more seriously considering voting for Trump, I would say a fair amount of those would be church attendees, in fact. So that's an interesting point, right? That I think is just worth thinking about as we're having this discussion. That doesn't mean that's where they're getting their politics from, but it does mean they're more likely to be there.
Let me step back and get on the point that all of you have been getting at, which is, how is a Catholic voter, how ought to, in an ideal world, a Catholic voter really approach voting in an election like this? Kathleen, you mentioned the preeminent priority language. There's the bishops have a voting guide, Faithful Citizenship, which I don't think anybody here has read, or if you have, raise your hand and you win a cup of coffee. Yeah, exactly. You're paid to.
It was my job.
You're paid
I
to.
wouldn't have read it otherwise.
But again, it's how should a Catholic voter, approach this election? Kathleen, let's go to you first.
How should we? Well, I think about what Pope Francis has called us to with a better kind of politics, right? He says we have to start engaging in a better kind of politics. And the things that he emphasizes in that are politics that are community building, that are non-dominating, right? That are charitable, and that seek the long-term common good over short-term interests. And when thinking about what if we approached voting from that perspective, I think it shifts the dialogue, shifts the process from thinking about comparing these parties on their positions on issues, right? Which maybe in normal times, that's the way to approach it. But in a time like this, when we are all seeing the chaos and the violence and the misinformation, using those four components of seeking community building, non-domination, charity, and long-term common good, I think can help us reframe what we should prioritize in the voting booth, right? That it's not, in this particular time, the long-term common good is not to seek someone who is going to put me in the tax bracket that I want to be in, right? It's to think about, okay, what is going to facilitate us being able to actually have conversations in a holistic way, in a charitable way, where we can disagree on policies, again, without it turning into a threat to use the military against me, right? Like, we have to think much more long-term if we're going to engage in a better kind of politics. And yeah, and I would also say that, beyond that, just the principle of the option for the poor, right, is so important, especially now, is thinking about how my vote will impact the poor and vulnerable right now.
Are left out of the conversation almost even in all of the polling. And it just that phrase, a better kind of politics, is taken from the Pope's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which is really worth reading at this moment. There's that one section on politics, and which is a politics of love. It's a really counter-cultural message in many ways, and I think, but very eloquent. I love the way the Pope, I think, talks at one point. He says, against, engage in politics against angelic forms of purity. We are Catholics, after all. But Michael-Shawn, and Kathleen, I love what you said, but we tend to look at issues. She mentioned the preeminent priority. Abortion, as we've been talking about, seems to be the one that just, blocks out everything. It's like, oh, you vote this way on this issue. We're in a post-Roe world, thanks to the Dobbs ruling. How should we think about all of these issues? How should we think about abortion in particular?
I think, the thing that got lost in the debate about faithful citizenship was the full title is Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. And, conscience, I tend to a pretty high view of conscience. Newman's letter to the Duke of Norfolk, it is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. And it is, and that it is not a long-sighted woefulness. And I think for some people, conscience is whim. Right. So we've got to, conscience as a Catholic means something more. It's God's voice in our head, speaking, to the divine law. But the point of conscience is that you are applying it. So my first objection to the bishop's language about preeminent priority for abortion is I don't think there's a single federal election ballot that will be cast this year that will have any impact on the abortion debate. I think there are going to be several state level debates about that, but I don't think the choice of president, I don't think you're going to see legislation that's going to get out of the Senate. I don't think anything. There's no, and so voting is a practical choice. You're picking this person for a 4 year, you're hiring somebody for 4 years or 6 years in the Senate. So if you're going to say, well, this issue is the most important, but it's an election and the race you're voting on has no bearing on it. Like, we're all going to vote for House members. And if your number one issue is Ukraine, you really have to be worried about the Senate, right? Or if you're worried about the direction of the courts, the Senate confirms, the House doesn't confirm. So, and all of that was absent from the bishop's calculations. I think the other thing that, I don't know the answer here, but I think the real moment where the pro-life movement lost its soul was in 2013 when the Indiana pro-life statewide group endorsed a pro-life Republican over an incumbent pro-life Democrat. And they always endorsed pro-life incumbents of either party. But they said, yeah, but we need to control the speakership of the state legislature to get what we want. If you were really going to, be on one issue and say, do the kind of moral Jeremy on that issue, you don't descend to the level of worrying about speakerships. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you can articulate a moral concern, but if you're going to start doing that tailoring, then a whole lot comes in and you've entered into a partisan political discussion that is really very different and requires a lot of nuance. And they didn't bring any of that nuance. But that was the real moment in 2013 where I think the pro-life movement had a real, it just said we're going to be an arm of the Republican Party, and at that moment lost its ability to win culturally at a deep level and over the long haul. So I guess my answer when people call I thought on the plane, what did the Pope say? It got lost because he had that awful cliche about the two evils, but he went on to say, you individual voters have to form your conscience. And that's the thing I would like to see our certainly I'm very blessed. I've got a great preacher in my parish. And that's what he's preaching on is you guys have to decide this. And our tradition is capacious enough to allow you to vote for conservatives or liberals or whatever. But you've got to form your conscience. And that's a kind of dialogue that you do with the Catholic tradition.
And again, yeah, thanks for referencing the Pope's remarks on the plane coming back from Asia last month, which, I thought it was quite unfortunate. He's basically, and as part of it was due to the setup of the question, one who's pro-abortion, one who's anti-immigrant. And he says, these are, two evils, you choose the lesser of two. But his point, I think, undermined that preeminent priority thing. He said, no, these are all, for him, all life is sacred. I love that. He said, I love his line in his first extended interview after he was elected in 2013. He said, everything is non-negotiable. There are no lives that are negotiable. So which means that you have to look at this prudentially. And conscience, as I said. Dan, though, how should, but again, there's also a degree, I think people look at this and say, form your conscience. It's like, well, their view of conscience is like, well, okay, I think this is best for me. It's like Kathleen said, it puts me in the right tax bracket. Or I think, you can kind of justify anything. It almost seems to take Catholic teaching out of the equation. What do you think about that? How should we form our consciences as Catholics?
Um, so what I think one of the things that gets lost on a lot of Americans because our country has been like pretty stable on the kind of larger structural level for a lot of its history, is these sort of bigger picture issues of like what kind of society do we want to live in? Right. There are a lot of other countries and a lot of other democracies that have had to face these questions in much more visceral ways, much more recently. I'm thinking of even of a place like France, right, where the government changed several times between the 1930s and the 1950s. Obviously, Germany had to face this in a very visceral way, multiple times, right? Of what kind of society do we want to be, and what kind of things can happen when a democracy goes sideways. And I think there is a kind of complacency among Americans, including a lot of American Catholics, in this moment, especially because we've already had a Trump administration. So I think there's a sense of some people that, well, we tried that once and and it went okay, which is not exactly how I would view it. I think Trump has helped a lot by the kind of blocking out of the events of 2020 on the part of much of the electorate because they were so unpleasant. So they turned the clock back to 2019. And also by a lot of people being willing to kind of turn their face away from January 6th. I had somebody that I knew from high school a while ago who was messaging me on Facebook about politics and was basically saying something like, well, basically, I just kind of vote based on like what kind of judges are going to get nominated, right? This is from a pretty conservative Catholic high school, right? This is clearly where he's coming from. And I said something about January 6th. He's like, oh, you take that seriously? It's like, well, actually, yes, I do. Right. But I don't think a lot of Americans, and one of the things that I think has gone on here is that the fact that, pretty much every World War II veteran is deceased. Right. So the generation that faced that conflict and faced those kind of real threats to democracy as a concept, and took it seriously and fought for it, are gone. And so I think people really need to take a hard look at what kind of society do we want to live in. And if you've enjoyed living in the kind of stable American society we've lived in, where we can hash things out at the ballot box and throw the bums out in 4 years if we don't like what they're doing, you have to think about what makes it most likely that in 2028 we're going to be having that conversation in something like the political order we've been used to, because it's not guaranteed. It won't last forever. And we want to, again, it's not preserving for the sake of preserving, but you have to think about the options.
I think it's a great point, and the irony that Catholics were among the great architects of defenders of democracy in this country, and the architects of the Catholic teaching on behalf of democracy. But one thing that gets to, and which is also in the comments that I want to pick up, is something that bothers me. You just leave issues aside, and I don't even know what Trump is. Pro-choice one day, he's pro-life another day. I'm not even sure what he is. But one thing I think he is in my view, an indecent person, and just in the sense of what the name calling, the behavior, the misogyny, all of these kinds of things. How should we think about that? Again, Dan, you said about the kind of society that we have that we've taken for granted. Hypocrisy is a wonderful thing. Was Rochefoucauld said it's the tribute that vice pays to virtue. Even if we haven't had saints as presidents, they always need to act in a certain way. Kathleen, is Trump's just personal behavior, is that important in Catholic teaching, in the Catholic calculus when choosing our leaders? Does personal integrity and behavior and these norms that we're all taught in Catholic schools, does that matter?
Absolutely. I think, that's really what's at stake here. And I think that's what I was getting at before in that it can be tempting to focus on issues, but it's so much bigger than that. And I hear, as Michael, Sean, and Dan have been saying, that there's, we've been talking a lot about the bishop's document, but they don't reference January 6th, right? There's not a talk about the big lie of undermining our democracy, right? And so I think there's a way in which the whole conversation that we're having as Catholics needs to be reoriented according to what is decent, right? What is good? What will we stand for? And one of the things that I find really concerning is that given that our church is hierarchical, and given that much of our theology and our theological tradition comes from a hierarchical, patriarchal worldview, I think it's very easy for Catholics to become susceptible to that kind of hierarchical conception, right? That thinking of authoritarianism as, well, as long as we're pursuing the kingdom of God, that's okay, right? Because we're ordering it towards a higher good. But we need to be really careful about that, not only because, of course, it can be dangerous, right? And people can turn and we can all of a sudden not be on the side of the of the one in power, right? But also, that's not what the kingdom of God is about, right? If we're looking at all of this movement to foster the kingdom of God through politics, right? Which is something, Catholic integralism is starting to have a moment, right? I think what we really need to recognize is that the kingdom of God is not some abstract thing, right? And we know that Pope Francis has called us to get down into the real and not the abstract, right? And when we look at what the kingdom of God is described as in the Bible, right? We have John the Baptist proclaiming the kingdom of God. And what does it look like? It looks like people sharing their clothes. It looks like people having enough to eat. People say, what is the kingdom of God? And he says, it's these things that are material. They're conducive to material flourishing. It's not abstract. It's very much embodied. And this, I saw in the poll, right? Or Michael, Sean, in your article that you wrote reacting to the poll, you said people were much more likely to say religion had a positive impact at a local level. And I think that's why, right? We see that when we are more local and we can see what the embodied effects are of our vision for society, we can help to build that, right? We can show care, we can show our Catholic values, if you will, in a more real way to our neighbors. And yet the abstract still has an effect on real people that we don't always see, right? And so I think, like I said at the beginning, we're in a choose your own adventure moment. I think if we're tired of the chaos and the political manipulation and the name calling and the divisiveness, and we're overwhelmed by all of this, we need to say enough is enough, right? We need to identify the source. It's coming from a particular party with a particular aim to make us feel despair and overwhelmed. And we need to say, we're not going to stand for that anymore.
One of those, again, I think I've been, and we've all been citing Donald Trump, but he's not alone on the ticket. The actual one Catholic in this race is J.D. Vance, the vice presidential nominee. Whether anyone knows he's Catholic or not, I don't know. His sense of humor is the least Catholic I've ever run across. But again, these things also, look at what his amplifying the lies about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, things like that. Michael, Sean, to you, what does this indicate? Joe Biden is out. He's out of the race. Joe Biden is emblematic of a century of Catholic politicians, the happy warrior type from Al Smith to now. And now J.D. Vance represents it. Is he the future?
I don't think so. I mean, he is emblematic and of a kind of convert to Catholicism who comes, ironically, as a critic of elite culture, but actually as a product of elite culture, and I think often fails to see the degree to which they're complicit in the very things that they're critiquing. And he is someone who I think to use some of the language that Kathleen was using, he would say, well, every time the left says we're going to be on the right side of history, I see that same religious, teleological, get out of my way, I'm pursuing, the righteous. And if you disagree with me, you're not just wrong, but you're evil and, all of that. And I think he is someone who, as often is the case, and we have had great converts. John Henry Newman was a convert.
I'm a convert, Michael Sean.
And okay, but well, and there's John Henry Newman, and then there's David Gibson and J.D. Vance. So no, but here's the deal. It is first. If I could ask one question at that VP debate, it would have been, Mr. Vance, when you converted to Catholicism, you were joining a religion that has the definition of universal in the title of the religion. Catholic means, universal and everywhere. And then you immediately want to railroad it into a nationalistic, avenue. What did you not understand about the word Catholic? I mean, so I think this is often the case with, and at this moment, in addition to a kind of distorted social teachings of the church that they do, you have the same group has a pretty pronounced hostility to Pope Francis, and you think of the number of Catholic converts who write or edit at a place like First Things, who have forgotten the joke, that being more Catholic than the Pope is a joke, right? And they attack Francis as he's insufficiently Catholic, and they're converts, and you want to say, like, Wednesday you were a Methodist. Who the hell are you to come in? And so I think he is dangerous in both his confusions and his intelligences. What I think one of the reasons the Trump voters I know, the first thing when you confront them with any particular thing the former president says is, "Oh, that's just him talking," and they really think that. Hey, look at the first term, and Bill Barr said this in the famous Caitlin Collins interview on CNN. He didn't overturn the democracy. What are you talking about? He was there for 4 years. And she was like, but he tried. And he was like, yeah, but it didn't work. I think there's real limits to that. And I think in a second term, he will have learned from the first and will be more aggressive in his efforts. But I think they do that is their reaction. The problem with Vance is it's not that kind of a gut level. I mean, I do think Vance being smarter than Trump at just having greater intellectual capacity could be a real dangerous player in this administration in a way that Pence was not. I mean, Pence, I disagree with Pence on 100 issues, but Pence was never a threat to the constitutional order. And I can imagine J.D. Vance, I don't think he's a fascist. I don't think he's, but, you can imagine him and Mussolini or Franco talking long into the night.
Dan Robert, what is this? Is this transition from a Joe Biden to a J.D. Vance? Is this a generational shift? Does this have a larger meaning for Catholics in America?
Well, I think it's indicative of a kind of fragmentation, right? So, as Michael Sean was saying, J.D. Vance represents a certain kind of Catholic politician, which is fairly new to American politics, which is this kind of convert, but also his kind of interest in the online right, and especially in these post-liberal intellectuals, right, who have been kind of in the intellectual workshop toying with kind of anti-democratic ideas. Somebody like Adrian Vermeule at Harvard, looking at ways to kind of harness statism for the purpose of conservative ends. And indeed, one of the people who really supported Vance for the vice presidential nomination included Elon Musk, right? And this is in part because for Vance, right, the pro-life cause is part of this broader cause of what's called pronatalism, which is trying to incentivize, twist arms, whatever is necessary to encourage Americans to have more children, which is kind of the flip side of taking down immigration, right? That, in other words, you need to get more people to do jobs, and the way to do it is to have more native babies. This again has some fascistic elements to it. right? It doesn't come out and say necessarily the more kind of racist versions of things that pronatalism can get into. But he is interested in that and sees those things as going together. So again, it is a new kind of thing. And again, the other thing with Vance that's really telling is that during the first Trump administration, he was a severe critic of Trump. Right, said some really nasty things about him, called him America's Hitler. And then suddenly, a couple of years ago, decided to stop saying those things and say something else. I'm reminded a bit of, for those familiar with Robert Bolt's play and the movie of A Man for All Seasons, where the character of Richard Rich, who's a young man on the make in the law, and it turns out is kind of willing to say whatever it takes to get ahead. Right? He's willing to say whatever it takes to get on the right side of the right people in order to get power for himself. And I think that, to Michael Sean's point, is one of the things that makes J.D. Vance dangerous. And again, that's a very different kind of Catholic politician than somebody like Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi, who in different ways come from sort of old line versions of Catholic politics that predate even somebody like the Kennedys. I think of John F. Kennedy's grandfather, Honey Fitzgerald in Boston, right? This kind of old time, glad handing Irish American politician that the Kennedys actually look down upon, but that Joe Biden in some ways is the last of. And it, that's a tradition in its own way, but it's one that's passing to this more ideological version, which is more complicated for Catholics because there's more contradictions to try to navigate there. But again, J.D. Vance is playing a different kind of game.
Let's, as we head towards the end of this hour, let's talk about November 6th, the day after the election. Whatever happens, this election is very close. The vote will be very close. It could go one way or the other. We are a divided nation now. We're a divided church now. We will be a divided nation and a divided church the day after. Kathleen, in your view, what are some, rather than looking forward to our vote afterwards, how do we build bridges? How do we rebuild connections? How do we develop that solidarity, even just within our church and hopefully within our society, that are really at the core of who we are as Catholics?
Great question.
Yeah,
thanks for nothing.
Thanks for nothing, David. But just solve all of our problems and then we'll log off. Yeah, exactly.
All right, perfect. Sounds good. So a couple of things that I would say. One is, I think we need to be careful of thinking about bridge building as meeting in the middle, because particularly when we look at things like lies and racism and misogyny, they are all things that negate the existence or the participation of others. And so the way to build a bridge with someone who has been engaging in these negations is to stand firm and bear witness to what is the truth of our being and our call to authentic community. Again, without it requires keeping that lane open, right? But being invitational and saying, what I have seen of the racism and the misogyny and the political lies, that is not okay. Here is a way to build community in a better way, right? So that's one thing I would say, is that I am wary of building bridges without recognizing harm and negation. But beyond that, I think, two things I would say. One is, I've been reading the social activist Joanna Macy recently, who is not Catholic, but has some wise things to say. And one of her, the structures that she offers for engaging in justice work is block, build, be. And so, meaning that first, we have to block harms where we see them, right? Like that's, it's not being partisan or being authoritarian or whatever to block a harm, right? But a harm that is actually physically identifiable, right? Not an abstract thing, but a harm. While we're blocking harms, we build the world we want to see, meaning that we can't just sort of turn the tables and begin to impose our vision of the world on somebody else, but we have to imagine what it looks like to actually engage in these in authentic community, right, where everyone can participate. And we have to start trying to build structures that will facilitate that. And then B, we have to embody the kinds of values and virtues that we want to see in the world. So, you know, and this is where I think the gifts of the Holy Spirit come into play, right? As we're building these bridges, thinking about what it is that helps us embody those gifts, the love, peace, joy, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, all of those things. If we can practice those and we see them in ourselves and we try to engage with others with those gifts, and at the same time recognize where we see those, I think that can be a source of hope and a source of connection.
Dan, with just a minute or two left, what do we do the morning after the election as Catholics?
I think, you know, a lot of it is trying to, you know, as best we can live into and help others live into the reality that we want to see. Right. And again, that doesn't mean papering over things. But it means, you know, trying to you know, build solidarity in whatever direction that needs to be built under whatever circumstances we're in. And you know, again, I think it's hard to know what that's going to look like depending on the version of what plays out and what the factors end up being. But I think it's trying to look at, you know, at that point, partisanship is not the issue anymore. Partisanship's the issue in the election itself. But afterward, into whatever we're facing, right, at that point, it's trying to call out to our best instincts and our best versions of ourselves as Americans and as humans.
Michael Sean, final word to you. What do we do on November 6th and going forward?
You know, I would say, and mindful that, you know, this is an error and see our audience. I think the Democratic Party has as much soul searching to do as the Republican Party, and how we made this politics possible. For 40 years, we were complicit with neoliberalism. We all bought into Bill Clinton's meritocracy nonsense, and still do this in our policies, you know, with things like student loan forgiveness. So, you know, I would encourage everybody to watch either the documentary or at least a couple interviews with Alexandra Pelosi, who is the daughter of Nancy Pelosi. And she went and she interviewed people who had been arrested and convicted for their participation in the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. And she said, you know, she went in thinking that they were going to be monsters. And what she found is, like, they cared about the same things she cared about. They just had a completely different worldview. And so when she was interviewed on NPR, her last word there is the one I would share to answer your question, which is go into a discussion and be prepared to believe that everything you think you know is wrong. Not what the other guy that he thinks or she thinks is wrong, but everything that you believe and you think is wrong, and then go have the conversation. And I think that's the kind of conversations we're going to need to have on the morrow of the election, no matter how it turns out.
Well, thanks to you all, Kathleen Bonnette, Dan Rober, Michael Sean Winters. I know this wasn't planned, but hopefully we can have a reprise of this conversation indeed after November 5th, because I'd love to hear what you say. And, you know, depending on how things go, I think this kind of conversation, as I said at the top, does give me hope and at least grounds us in the kind of reality and charity that we need now and we're going to need going forward. So thank you all very much. Back to you, Lori.
Thank you, everyone. Wow, what a session. And I love the idea, David. And I will shamelessly ask all of our presenters if they would be willing to come back for a, I don't want to say post-mortem, let's say post-election discussion. So thank you very much, everybody. David, a special